Welcome to Trust Talk. Trust shapes the way businesses collaborate. But what happens when trust isn't there, or when it's taken too far? In this episode of Trust Talk, we dive into buyer-supplier relationships with Dominika Latusek, an expert in interorganizational trust. She shares insights on how trust influences performance, why it sometimes misaligns, and when too much trust can actually backfire. From real-world business dynamics to the hidden risk of trust traps, this conversation challenges what we think we know about trust in partnerships. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Dominika, welcome to Trust Talk. Today we are diving into a topic you've explored in your research, the role of trust in buyer-supplier relationships, or BSR. With millions of transactions occurring every second between buyers and suppliers across the globe, it's fascinating to examine the part trust plays in these interactions, if at all.
Yes, thanks for having me, Severin. I'm very happy to be here. And indeed, trust in buyer-supplier relations is a fascinating and very universal topic. And I think particularly two aspects make it fascinating. So first, the role of trust. So what does trust enable between buyers and supplier? What is the extra value that trust adds to this equation? And then the second aspect that makes it fascinating is a realistic perspective that I very much like. So there are cases in real life, and these cases are not rare, where we have to manage and be economically successful in our business deals without trust or with little trust. So the other aspect of being realistic about trust is that there are limits to trust, and trust is not a magic formula that will solve all problems of buyer-supplier collaboration. And within that topic, my research is on one particular subfield, which is value chain relationships. So trust between organizations, inter-firm level, buyers and suppliers as organizations, not as individual partners. So my first research project in life was when I was working on a doctoral dissertation. It was in Poland, first decade of this century, so still very turbulent, dynamic times of transition on all levels, economics, business, culture, social sphere as well. I was supposed to study trust between suppliers and buyers of tailor-made software projects, so long-term inter-organizational collaboration. I was doing qualitative methods only, so observations, interviews, and I was quite surprised, if not shocked, because the most recurring topic in all my qualitative data, in my interviews, was not trust, but exactly the opposite. Mistrust, lack of trust, distrust, and of course, imagine I was a PhD candidate tasked with a topic of trust. So basically finding the opposite in real life was not something that made me very happy. I felt shocked, I felt lost, but anyway, this is how my interest in trust began and how I started to think about trust in a more realistic way. Trust is something extra, but it's not always there.
In one of your recent publications, you identify three key factors in evaluating buyer-supplier relationships: perceived performance, satisfaction, and trust. Can you explain how these factors are connected and why they are so critical in creating successful transactions between a buyer and a supplier?
Well, this is quite a huge question. So why don't we split it into two parts? Perceived performance, relationship satisfaction, and trust, as you just listed. Of course, these three factors are not new. They're quite well established in the literature on quality of inter-firm partnerships. But in fact, these are the three most often mentioned criteria used for evaluating inter-firm collaboration. So let's start with perceived performance. I think we all realize how much effort goes into measuring performance of both individual companies and interorganizational partnerships. There are efforts to measure performance in a way that would be seen as objective, comprehensive. We have financial measures, for example, that we can compare across the board. However, if you look at this carefully, for evaluation of quality of specific cases of partnerships, what really matters is perceived performance. So, not some kind of objective measures, but what matters is how partners see it, how we interpret the performance of a partner. Let me give you an example. You may have little or no financial profit from, let's say, a joint venture, but you might be in an early stage. It might be an investment stage. So you are not expecting financial profit at that point. You may be actually losing money, but still your overall evaluation of that partnership may be very positive. This is an easy example, but there are less obvious cases. For example, you may be losing money in your partnership because of external shocks. There might be pandemics. There might be war. And then, you don't blame the partner, but you kind of look for reasons of that underperformance outside of the relationship. So your perceived performance of the partner may be quite positive, irrespective of having financial measures not on a very satisfactory level. So the first factor you mentioned is this perceived performance, and it's important to remember that it's seen in the eyes of the partner. It's not some objective measure, it's our subjective perception. The second factor is relationship satisfaction, and it refers to these intangible aspects of collaboration when we simply like our partner. There is mutual understanding, there is respect, there might be shared values, and this is type of satisfaction that comes from rewarding social interactions. Perceived performance was about tangible benefits. Relationship satisfaction is about more intangible gains. And then the third factor, trust. What's important for inter-firm collaboration is that assessment of trustworthiness of our partners is conducted in a different way than in interpersonal interactions. Between people, there are usually 3 dimensions reflected in the famous ABI model that was also in your podcast: ability, benevolence, and integrity. On inter-firm level, we talk more often about 2 components of trustworthiness: competence and goodwill. So benevolence and integrity are kind of merged into one bigger dimension of goodwill. Competence is expertise, skills, resources to deliver on what we promise. And goodwill relates to partners' integrity, intentions. This is the element that goes beyond what's specified in a contract. What we are doing for our partner, which is not officially required. So these are the 3 factors usually used to evaluate the quality of buyer-supplier relationships.
Building on that, you've also developed an evaluation scale to measure these factors in buyer-supplier relationships. How does this tool work in practice, and how do you see these businesses using it to strengthen their partnerships and foster trust?
Well, this work has just been published at the end of last year, so we must wait to see whether and how it resonates with the public, but let's also be realistic about potential practical applications. We all know that the transfer of knowledge between academia and the world of practice has its own challenges. So I'm not sure practitioners do read academic journals. But having said that, we indeed developed that evaluation scale, combining 3 factors mentioned before, and I believe it may be useful for regular evaluation checks, especially for partnerships that have been in place for a while. There are risks and traps associated with long duration of collaboration, and I'm sure you know about these from daily life. They are common experience also in our interpersonal relationships. So when there is a partnership that has been working for a while, where we develop familiarity, we kind of like the partner, we are used to each other, we have our routines, then there's also a dark side to that. We may miss interesting opportunities in the environment. We become vulnerable to the opportunism of our trusted partner. Sometimes research shows that innovation may be stifled because we develop emotional bonds. We don't want to have tensions. We don't want to have disagreements. We want to nurture the trust. So this is quite a complicated landscape. And having regular checks with some standard, quick and easy measurement instrument may really help here. That was mainly our intention when developing the scale. And then you can kind of have a signal, an information that there is some misalignment between the three factors that should be aligned. And you can have a signal that you should dig deeper. Maybe you should evaluate that particular partnerships.
We come back to that backfire element that you just mentioned later on in our conversation. My question is, while developing your scale, were there any findings that surprised you? Something about trust or satisfaction or performance that made you think, I didn't see that coming?
Yes, we had two surprising findings. The first one is interesting from a theoretical perspective. So I mentioned earlier that when we study trust between firms, we kind of divide it into two elements: goodwill, trust, and competence, trust. And what's interesting in our model is that the analysis shows very clearly that there is one factor, there is one trust. So trust can have different foundations. It can be based on how competent the partner is. It might be based on whether we see the partner as well-intentioned. So whether we recognize the goodwill, but in the end, there is one trust. These two elements load onto one factor. So this has practical implications, not only theoretical, but practical implications as well. Because if you want to build trust with your business partners, if you want to inspire trust towards your organization, you should show both at the same time. You should show your ability, but you should also show your integrity. The second finding that was kind of surprising and we didn't see coming was the phenomenon we observed in our empirical data, which was the divergence between trust and perceived performance. We are working on this right now, trying to figure out what the reasons might be and what the logic behind such cases might be. We call them misalignment cases. It is surprising because the common assumption in value chain research is that trust and performance go hand in hand. And it was startling and unexpected to have cases which clearly showed misalignment. So high performance, low trust, or high trust and low performance. We can talk about that later on.
Yeah, I would be interested in an example, a case where you noticed that. Do you have one?
There are several cases, but you might think about collaborations that have been in place for a while. Trust has been developed, trust has been established, and even if something goes wrong, even if the partner is not delivering, then if there's trust between us, I tend to blame external environment, for instance, or I tend to blame other partners in the value chain. At all costs, we want to save trust. Right. So we want to save this trusting relationship. So that would be one of the examples. So in research, we call it shadow of the past.
Trust and satisfaction are such human qualities. You mentioned goodwill, for example. Yet they are critical in these buyer-supplier relationships. Do you think the emotional side of business partnerships is underestimated?
Severin, thank you for asking this question. This is a topic that is super important academically, but personally very close to my heart. So far, we talked about statistics, factors, models, but mainly in my work, I used qualitative methods. And also in that project, we conducted interviews and observations to build the scale to evaluate buyer-supplier relationships. And through interviews and observations, I quite often have a chance to see this more intangible side of business relationships. And for instance, in this project where we developed the scale, it's clearly visible in interviews that this relational, emotional side of business is critical. Interorganizational partnerships are ultimately between people. They are initiated, sustained, and sometimes terminated by people, not by some abstract organization. So only for this reason, we cannot turn away from this emotional, psychological aspects. And of course, research recognizes that as well. There's a huge area of studies of boundary spanners. So individuals who connect organizations, they serve as interpersonal bridges between two collective entities. But on the other hand, I think research also warns us that we need a balance in how we see this personal aspect of inter-firm relationships, because there are trust traps. We just mentioned an example of a trust trap. There's over-embeddedness, there's path dependency. So all these academic terms, which basically alert us to the fact that we should not overestimate this interpersonal aspect. And research shows us that for a good value chain relations, we need both reality checks, performance evaluations, and good atmosphere and trust. And as in many areas of life, balance is key.
You found that trust and performance are connected in a way that they reinforce each other. Does that mean that if a supplier is trusted, buyers might overlook small performance issues, or does trust always depend on good results?
So we already touched upon that briefly. Let's maybe just reiterate that common assumption is in existing literature, existing research, is that we take for granted that trust and performance are aligned. So high trust should translate into high performance should translate into high trust. However, this is, as you said, not always the case. And we are now looking into why this misalignment cases may actually exist in real life. And we see that there are several groups of reasons. So first, reasons may concern partners themselves. There might be power asymmetries, small and big organizations that create tensions. For instance, a small partner may be worried of the opportunistic behavior of the big partner. Even if the big partner's performance is great, still the small partner may be afraid I may not show such a high trust. So then we would have misalignment between the two. On the other hand, when we have these big small tensions, even if performance of the bigger partner is low, a small partner may still trust them because there are reputational effects. So trust may be high even if performance outcomes are lower. Then there are other possible reasons linked to duration of the partnership. And I think we already covered that with several examples that if we collaborate for a long time, there's the shadow of the past. There might also be shadow of the future. Our performance may be low at the moment, but we may hope for improvement. So we may have low results, low financial outcomes at the moment, but our trust may be high because we really hope for future improvements. And then finally, there's the third group of factors that may contribute to misalignment. So there are context characteristics. As I mentioned, I'm coming from Poland, and when we experience that quite often, when you are in unstable institutional environment, when you don't have that safety net of law to resort to in cases of, let's say, conflict, then you are less likely to trust because you are in an unstable, unsafe environment. And then even if the business performance is great, trust may actually be low. So there are also contextual factors influencing that.
Trust isn't always built on goodwill alone. In some industries, we see the use of what are called hostage arrangements, like equity stakes or specialized investments to safeguard partnerships. Can you explain, first of all, what hostage arrangements are, and secondly, how they are used to establish or even reinforce trust in these buyer-supplier relationships?
Let me give you an example. Let's say we make a joint investment into something, right? Then we split risk. That would be type of a hostage arrangement. So, or we can exchange equity, right? We can exchange equity stakes between our organizations and the companies, and we create legal, formal interdependencies. From the trust building perspective, that makes a lot of sense because we built that safety infrastructure that I mentioned in my previous answer. To put it simply, I would say that we make it very costly for the partner not to honor our trust. We kind of encourage the partner to behave in a trustworthy way. And on the other hand, it's easier for us to trust the partner if we, for instance, exchanged equity. So we can be sure from the institutional point of view, from the legal point of view, that we have common interest in the success of a joint enterprise. Let me refer to one of your previous guests in the podcast, Guido Mullering. He actually talks precisely about this process in his concept of trust as a leap of faith. Trust for Guido is the acceptance of uncertainty, like leaping over the uncertainty. And just imagine what trust is. Trust is like making this leap. So creating hostage arrangements is making this gap small enough to be able to leap over it. We kind of make the field of uncertainty smaller, more manageable, and then we can make this jump. I would say this is the area where the practice and theory connect well. We can really picture how that works in practice. This opens up a whole new debate, which we are not touching upon right now, asking what trust really is. Because if we make this gap of uncertainty very, very small, then do we really need trust? If we create hostage arrangements and if we create mutual dependencies to the point where I'm actually certain of your future behavior, then the need for trust is really eliminated.
That's an interesting angle, Dominika, and I'm keeping this for maybe a future interview I may have with one of your colleagues. So let's move to the last question. You also mentioned somewhere, and I think somewhere in the beginning of our conversation you referred to that, the dark side of trust, where too much trust or satisfaction can lead to complacency or missed opportunities. Can you explain how this happens and why is it important for businesses to strike the right balance in their relationships?
Of course, I think this is something that we all observe, not only in business, but in personal life as well. Many psychologists say that trust is a basic human need. In general, trust is good. This is the common perception. Trust is nice. We want to trust others and we want to be trusted. And if we are in a trusting relationship, if our satisfaction is high, if there's a good climate, there is support, there is understanding, we want this to last. We will work towards sustaining trust even if something goes wrong. Even if there is evidence that our partner has some deficits, we tend to work towards sustaining trust. And now going to business relations, very similar processes may be at work. Within organizations, there's research showing that, for example, in teamwork, if the team has great atmosphere, if people really like each other, they sometimes become less innovative. Why? Simply because they have this trust, they have this emotional bond. They may not want to hurt someone. If they are friends, they may be less willing to speak openly, not to have clashes, not to have conflict. But of course, on the other hand, if there is no trust or little trust, the same may happen. Innovation may be stifled, but then our withdrawal or our holding back is built on a different motivation. We may self-censor ourselves because we are afraid of how others will react. There might be fear to be ridiculed, fear not to be taken seriously. So it's difficult in practice not to overinvest in trust, but not to underinvest in trust at the same time. And maybe just last word, it's good to think about this right level of trust as a fluctuating condition. So, it's not stable. It's about constant adjustments, constant updating. It's a dynamic alignment process, not some level that we can set up front.
Right. Well, that concludes our conversation, Dominika. Thank you very much for your insights. Listening to you, I'm sure that there are still a lot of areas that you want to research with you and your colleagues. I wish you good luck with that. Thank you for being our guest and explaining these fascinating aspects of trust.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Trust Talk. We hope today's conversation inspired new insights into the transformative power of trust. At Trust Talk, we're committed to exploring trust's role in shaping a better world, one story at a time. If our mission resonates with you, we invite you to support us. Your donation, no matter the size, helps us continue these meaningful conversations. Visit us at trusttalk.co/donate to contribute and be part of this journey. Thank you for listening and being part of the Trust Talk community. We can't wait to have you join us again for the next episode.